Today we're going to be learning about trig functions at basic angles in degree mode. So we know if we have sine, cosine, and tangent, what we use to remember what each of these represent as ratios is SO, ca, toa. So that means if we have some angle right here, and we know this is our hypotenuse because it's across from the right angle, this is the side opposite, and this is the side adjacent. Then sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So all these functions are ratios of sides in a right triangle. Now you might be wondering, what happens if our hypotenuse is 1? In that case, let's consider a circle whose radius is 1. Notice that this is the hypotenuse of this right triangle. Then we have two sides, a blue side and a green side of our triangle. This side is the hypotenuse. We have opposite and we have adjacent. Well, our adjacent length is actually along the x-axis, so this is just x. And along our y-axis is this blue line, or parallel to it, so this is y. So then we end up with this point, x comma y, on our circle. If this happens, then we realize sine, which is normally opposite over adjacent, now becomes y over 1, or just y. Our cosine, which is normally adjacent over hypotenuse, becomes x over 1, or just x. And lastly, our tangent, which is normally sine over cosine, would become y over x. Now, this brings us to something called the unit circle. So we're going to fill in part of this today and part of this later on down the road. So if we have a circle whose radius is 1, that means all over, anytime I draw a line, this radius is 1. So I might take this radius and go out 30 degrees. If I do that, this side is 1, and we've got our 30 degrees right here. Or I might take it and do a 45-degree angle. Or I might take it and make a 60-degree angle. Now, what's interesting is the points on the circle, which are just points x comma y, are going to tell us what the sine or cosine is of this specific triangle that we drew. So in general, we want to write that x comma y actually becomes cosine of whatever angle, we'll just call it theta, and then sine of theta is represented by y. So as it turns out, if we have a 30-degree angle, then the coordinate of this point you can figure out is square root of 3 over 2, comma 1/2. A 45-degree angle, this point on the circle, turns out to be square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. And lastly, our 60-degree angle, it turns out that that is 1/2 and then square root of 3 over 2. So that means if you memorize the points on the unit circle, you have memorized the cosine and sine for these three angles that typically appear a lot. So now we know our cosine and sine for 30, 45, and 60 degrees. So what we're going to do today is just fill in a table of these basic values, and as this unit progresses, you'll end up memorizing these values. So let's make this helpful table for ourselves. Now if we look sine of 30, well, if I look for sine of 30, I'm going to go up to my unit circle and look for the y value. That y value is 1/2. The x value was square root of 3 over 2. If I looked for sine of 45, well, let's look for the x value and the y value. Both are the same, so cosine and sine are both square root of 2 over 2. And lastly, let's look at our x and y values for 60 degrees. So if we have our 60 degrees, we realize that is 1/2 for x, which means cosine is 1/2, and sine is square root of 3/2. Notice how there's a little bit of a pattern here that will help you memorize it. This 1/2 and 1/2 kind of switch spots. And this square root of 3/2 and this square root of 3/2 also switch spots. The last thing that we need to figure out is the tangent of an angle. So if you remember, our tangent of an angle is equal to sine over cosine. So what we can do is put 1/2 over square root of 3/2 to figure out what sine of 30 is. So if we do 1/2 divided by square root of 3/2, you might remember with fractions we can keep change flip. So this becomes 1/2 times 2 over square root of 3, or that becomes 1 over square root of 3. Our last step, since we can't have a square root in the denominator, is to rationalize by multiplying by square root of 3 over square root of 3, in which case it becomes square root of 3 divided by 3. So there's our tangent of 30 degrees. Next we have tangent of 45. If you notice, if you take sine divided by cosine, since it's the same value, anything divided by itself will just give us 1. Lastly, our 60 degrees, if we take sine divided by cosine, well, that becomes square root of 3/2 times 2/1. These 2's will cancel to give us square root of 3. So if you memorize sine and cosine for these values, the only thing left to figure out is tangent. So you don't necessarily have to memorize tangent as long as you know your sines and cosines really well. So you're going to want to study this table as much as possible.